feel free to sign up on our website. All right, so now to get to tonight's program, we have Patti Smith from the Bonnievale Environmental Education Center from over in Brattleboro, Vermont, kind of our sister organization to the Harris Center. And Patti Smith's a naturalist there that's been working since 1991. She's also a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. And tonight she's gonna talk to us about a porcupine that she knows named Burdock. So Patti, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Miles. It's really great to be here virtually at the Harris Center again. And for those of you who don't know anything about Bonnievale, we are over the river and through the woods in southeastern Vermont, where we have a little old farmstead with a couple of miles of trails. And like the Harris Center, we do school programs, science-based nature education in all of the regional schools, public programs like this one. We also do salamander crossing brigades, vacation day camps. Oh my goodness, lots of other things. But wildlife rehabilitation is one of the things we do, and one of the things that will inform tonight's presentation, because I am just very delighted to have a chance to talk to you about one of my favorite wildlife children, Burdock. And not just because he was a great character, but also because he gave me introduction into the society of porcupines. So the things that I knew about porcupines before I became a wildlife rehabilitator were the kinds of things that environmental educators keep in their hip pockets to trot out at every opportunity. They are very well defended rodents. They have 30,000 quills, actually modified guard hairs. They are nocturnal, herbivorous. They mate in the fall. It's a very noisy affair. And then following a gestation of 7 months, they give birth in the spring to a single porcupet. And if I had to describe porcupines in a nutshell, I would say, oh yes, they're solitary, curmudgeonly creatures, very calm, though, unflappable. Now, porcupines are one of the easiest animals to study in the winter because they leave such clear evidence. Porcupines are active all winter long, even in the very worst weather. Most animals have the good sense to just wait out movement after a deep snowstorm, let things sinter, and then get out and about. But porcupines will just blast through a blizzard, back and forth between their den sites and the trees that they feed in. I just wanted to share this picture with you because you can see here that on this slightly slippery slope, the porcupine is using his tail as a brake. So you can see the quills in the bottom of the tail. I could talk for a whole hour about porcupine tails. They're just amazing, amazing appendages, but I won't. Anyway, so their den sites are often in rock outcrops underneath rocks, any place that gives them cover. Hollow trees are also very much in favor. I happen to live in a place with lots of rocky den sites. So what I do in the winter is go from rocky den site to rocky den site and track the porcupines from their dens to their feeding sites, which are very obvious. They love hemlock trees. That's their preferred winter food around here. And they climb out as far as their fat bodies can on those branches and pull in the tender branches at the ends and nibble off the very best parts and drop the twigs down onto the forest floor for the pleasure of the rabbits and deer that can come along afterward. I have followed, most of the time, the trails lead just a short distance between these feeding trees and their dens, but occasionally you'll find, especially a male porcupine, a dominant male porcupine, will do a big circuit on a good day and visit all of the other porcupines in the neighborhood. You can also learn a lot about porcupines by reading this book, The North American Porcupine by Aldous. I really recommend it. He's a researcher in the Catskills who's been studying porcupines for eons, and it has a lot of the great technical information in it. But as a wildlife rehabilitator, I have had a completely different window for studying and learning about these amazing little critters. So before we get to Burdock, our protagonist this evening, I need to introduce Dandelion the Dreadful. It was May 10th, 2014. I got a phone call from a woman who was driving down some highway in eastern Vermont and said, I've just seen a porcupine hit by a car, and while she was dying, she gave birth. And this remarkable woman pulled the baby porcupine out of its birth caul and cut the umbilical cord and brought her right to me, I shall say, because here she is, Dandelion the Dreadful at 1 day old. So baby porcupines, as I mentioned before, they're born in a litter of one. They're born fully quilled, thus the call, but the little quills are in all of this fur, and they're born with soft quills that harden up within a few hours. Oh, Dandelion the Dreadful, what to say about you? One of the first things that rehabilitators learn is that baby mammals need a mother, and when deprived of their natural mother, they will choose whomever treats them in a motherly way. And they really do not thrive if they're left on their own. So I spent a lot of time with this porcupine. She grew quickly and well and soon learned to climb, and I learned how you pick up porcupines. It's from underneath, of course, grab the base of the tail. I had to keep her from climbing very far because she did get stranded in the top of the first tree, and I had to call in the fire brigade with their 30-foot ladder to get her down. It was also very difficult that summer to get any work done because Dandelion would go off and play on her own for a while, and then she really needed attention. I don't know how parents do it. Now, she had an unusual childhood, as you know already. She had a number of experiences that most porcupines never do, but what's really weird about this to me is that she wanted to go for a canoe ride. She would just follow me everywhere, happy to go in and out of the car. So porcupines are what we call neophiles as opposed to neophobes. So many of the baby animals that I raise get to a certain age and they suddenly become fearful of almost everything. I show you this picture just to show you that porcupines are so chill. With those 3,000 pools, they really aren't nervous animals. Oh, we're canoeing. Oh, this is interesting. She just wandered around the canoe. She was also temporarily almost a film star. This is a BBC film crew. They wanted to get some footage of porcupines for a presentation they were working on. Dandelion was as uncooperative as a wild animal ought to be. And they ended up cutting her from the film, but got some really great footage anyway. So while she was in my care, one evening in the fall, this other baby porcupine arrived on my doorstep. This is while Dandelion, I was doing a soft release, so she was out in the yard and not shut in her enclosure. And just a puzzle, why would this other little porcupine arrive here? Puzzle at the time. I think we've figured it out now. I brought Dandelion up to meet this other little porcupine, and they just said, and ignored each other, which made me think that they were very well acquainted with each other already. So that's just a little aside that it will come back later. So Dandelion went off and found herself a den out in the woods, and I would go out and visit her, and here she is all grown up. All grown up, coming to get her bottle. So I was inspired by a moose rehabilitator to keep giving this porcupine a bottle as long as she wanted it, so she would get nice and fat and be ready for the winter, and also stick around where I could keep an eye on her. That humming noise, that's the porcupine contact greeting noise. Herbivores, I have to say, especially porcupines, are the fussiest eaters in the world, and it is so challenging to get them to eat what they're supposed to eat. A lot of it has to do with the microbiota that they obtained from their mother, and this she did not have, and so she was eating foods that she was supposed to eat in the wilderness. And I ended up bringing her back into custody in the winter. But by the next summer, she was doing fine and eating the things she was supposed to eat. So I finally released her again. And here she goes off into the wilderness. So the day that I released her, she headed off into her familiar woods. And instead of going right up a tree, which is what she usually does, she wandered and wandered and wandered, sniffing and sniffing and sniffing. And porcupines are very olfactory animals. And when she finally went up a tree, darned if there wasn't another little porcupine up it. And here's where it gets weird, because they sat near each other in this little tree all day. And then when it was evening and Dandelion was ready to become active, these are the sounds that she made when the other porcupine, whoops, that's not the right one, darn it. Okay, I'm just gonna have to imitate it for you. She started squealing her head off. Oh my God, she swears like a pirate. And that's no exaggeration. And the poor little guy, he finally came down and waddled off, and she just stayed up there in the tree. And I do have a number of explanations for this that we'll get to later. But the next morning, Dandelion finally came down and waddled off into the forest, and I haven't seen her again. And one of the things I learned in Aldous Rose's book about porcupines is that the female young tend to disperse while the male young tend to stay on their mother's territories. So what is this bear doing here? How many of you know about Ben Killam? He is the very lucky wildlife rehabilitator who gets to raise all of the bear cubs from Vermont and New Hampshire. And at the time that Dandelion disappeared, I was very interested in his research. And so before I introduce you to this evening's protagonist, Burdock, I want to say just a few things about bears. Like porcupines, bears were once believed to be very solitary. And what Ben and other researchers have found is that while bears are self-sufficient once they leave their mother, and defend their own territories, they also exist in an ursine society, and they know and interact with large numbers of other bears. And we ask Ben why this is, and he says he thinks it's because bears rely on resources that are patchy in distribution, and they depend on food that often has sporadic surpluses. Especially when they need to fatten for hibernation, they are dependent on nut crops. And if they're to put on enough weight to successfully have cubs, they really need to be able to double in weight eating nuts. Furthermore, no bear can defend a territory that contains all of the resources they need. So their survival depends on access to surplus in different areas. And they succeed in having access to these surpluses by sharing with other bears. And he says that in his studies of bears, he's found that they form alliances and coalitions with unrelated bears and share food based on a system of reciprocal altruism. He has found that they manage this social behavior with complex verbal and olfactory communication. So that bear that's rubbing on that tree right there is leaving its scent for all of the other bears. And he has found that at these mast stands where they feed to fatten for the winter, they have a feeding order. The dominant bear who owns the territory gets to go in there and feed first. And when he or she is done, then the next group can go in and feed. Some of the other things that make this possible are this crazy thing that bears do. Even young bears, they have this explosive emotional response that can really intimidate other bears. So allows even animals lower on the hierarchy to demand fair treatment. And young bears routinely test the tolerance of dominant bears to learn the rules. So it's really a very rigid hierarchical society, but it is built upon this need to share. So Ben goes a little bit further. Bear with me. He says that he thinks that studying bears' social arrangements might be a better way to think about Homo sapiens social relationships. And he thinks that humans and bears are the only species that share surplus resources. I'm about to argue with that. But he thinks that chimpanzees are strictly territorial and they really don't share with other chimpanzees. And maybe by studying bear societies, where groups of bears really have this system of trading and sharing, we might learn more about where human behavior evolved. Back to porcupines. After Dandelion waddled off into the wilderness, that fall I got another call about a little porcupine. It was September. Porcupines ought to be old enough to be on their own. But this particular porcupine weighed about the same as Dandelion weighed when she was 6 weeks old. He was very tiny. An adult porcupine had been killed on the road nearby not so long ago. And so little Burdock arrived at my orphanage. Before we talk more about Burdock, I'm just going to back up a little bit and talk about the ways in which porcupines are similar to bears. Then we'll dive right into Burdock's story. So porcupines, like bears, depend upon resources that are patchy in distribution and have sporadic surpluses. They're not omnivores like people and bears. They're herbivores, hindgut fermenters. They survive by maintaining a very careful energy balance. This low quality food takes forever to digest. And to survive the long, cold winters, they have to put on an awful lot of fat in the fall. They also need good shelters. Those are patchily distributed across the landscape. You have to be very particular about which plants and plant parts you spend your time digesting. And so I'm going to use Burdock to help me argue that porcupines have also evolved to share resources and depend on social networks to locate the resources they need to survive. So Burdock's sad story. He arrives at the orphanage and spends the first day just huddled miserably in the corner of his cage. And I do my best to woo him. I'm pretty good at making porcupine noises now. Finally, the next day I let him out of the cage and he's waddling around in misery, but I have a special tool. I have a porcupine puppet. So I put the porcupine puppet on and I make the porcupine puppet waddle around and make porcupine noises, and Burdock comes bounding over and leaps onto the porcupine puppet and just hugs it for dear life. And at that point, our relationship is sealed, and he has accepted me as his, maybe not mother. He's old enough to know I'm not his mother, but I'm his caretaker. And for those of you who have never seen Porcupine play, here is Porcupine Burdock playing with his puppet. Whoops. So I used to wonder while watching Burdock play with the puppet, if mother porcupines play with their children, or if they have to find someone else to play with. More on that later. Yes. So incidentally, porcupine quills do not come out unless the porcupine is very alarmed. And then there has to be some impact that breaks a little membrane that holds the quills in place. So this looks like it might be dangerous for the puppeteer, but the teeth are dangerous. The quills are not. So I would take Burdock for walks every day, and he would get to explore the things that porcupines need to explore. And I learned so much about porcupine behavior while I was out there with him. My goat is along on this particular walk. So this is the time of year when he's now starting to think about finding a den, and he's doing an awful lot of sniffing around. And this is what porcupines do when they play. He may also be slightly agitated because another big dominant male porcupine has been doing some scent marking in this area. You can imagine this is also how porcupines have to defend themselves if they encounter one of their friends, the fishers. What are you doing, Burdock? So here he is discovering this little fir tree has been marked by Big East, the dominant male porcupine in the neighborhood. Porcupines, as they walk through the woods, they straddle anything they can straddle and leave some urine on it. So the woods in my neighborhood are just redolent of porcupine and their signposts. Communicating so much. So we got to a certain point where Burdock would be following me home, and he'd come to this invisible fence of porcupine scent, and he would know that he couldn't follow me any further, and he would turn around and run away. So he finally did find a den site, and it happened to be the very den site that Dandelion shows, which is further evidence that porcupines follow each other to learn about potential resources. And he was doing pretty well. I knew where he was. I would go out every day and make sure he had things to eat. Here he is on a very frosty morning in January. And then one day he was gone, and it was this kind of crusty, snowy day, but I managed to find a very faint line of tracks going off across the snow through here. And I followed him over the hill and over the dale and came to this cherry tree on top of a hill. And there he was way up in this cherry tree. And curiously enough, underneath this cherry tree, I found porcupine scat that were small like his and large like an adult porcupines. And there's nothing that porcupines are eating in a cherry tree in the winter. And I saw no sign of browsing up there. It seemed like it was just a a place that porcupines go. I'm not sure exactly what the significance was. And he would go there pretty much every day. One day I saw some big fisher tracks going by, so I went over and asked him if he wouldn't like to come down and follow me home, which he did. And then one day, his tracks led to the cherry tree and then kept going. And I managed to follow them over the next hill and dale and to the ledge site where I knew other porcupines had been denning. And sure enough, there in a nice cave that I would later call the Gentleman's Club, there were 3 porcupines. One of them was a very bratty little burdock who was not letting the other porcupines, who were rather alarmed by my arrival, he was not letting them out. He just stood his ground and squealed at them whenever they came close. And he was very happy to come out and see me and wrestle and get a couple of porcupine biscuits. And he stayed at the Gentleman's Club for about a week. And then disappeared again. And I figured that the other guys probably just got sick of him. His manners were terrible. And this is just a couple of little shots of enjoying burdock at the Gentleman's Club. They wouldn't let me inside. So from there, he moved to this den complex that I call High Scenic. And there's this great big cave on this one end. And so I started going to visit him there. There he is. He's got this very nice skirt of long white quills. Incidentally, Aldous Rose, the author of North American Porcupine, tells us that like skunks, porcupines use this black and white pattern to be seen as dangerous and at night. The pattern stands out. So I get to spend some time hanging out with my pal Burdock in this lovely cave. And one night we're sitting in there and I hear crunch, 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 crunch coming up along from the outside. And here comes another porcupine. I think I recognize this porcupine from the Gentleman's Club. And I call this porcupine Dangerous Dan. I would later learn that Dangerous Dan is a female. Dangerous Dan walks past me and goes over and hides in a corner and finds an apple that I brought along for Burdock and eats the apple. And here is a little interaction between Burdock and Dangerous Dan. That's Burdock talking. Now notice that porcupines spit out apple peels as they eat apples. When they're done, there's a nice little perfectly cleared off core and a pile of apple skinned parings. So Dan and Burdock, it turns out, have got a really interesting relationship. I often see them out together, following each other around and humming very nicely to each other. So she, an adult female, he a juvenile male. But Burdock is still being bratty and saying, hey, hey, my food over here. So this is just a marvelous porcupine den complex. And what I learned hanging out with Burdock here is that as the winter ends, and all right, this may be particular to my neighborhood, but the porcupines seem to become social in the spring. And this den complex was to become a bit of a gathering site. And not just for porcupines, these rocks heat up in the evening light and they're home to red squirrels. And down here we have a little red-backed vole. And at dusk, when that evening sun hits this western exposed slope, the porcupines would come out on their stoops and absorb the sunlight. Here you see Dangerous Dan at the entrance to that cave, just dozing in the sunlight. And now I'm gonna introduce you to the 6 different porcupines that I got to know at this den complex in that spring social season. Dangerous Dan, we now know to be female. And I've learned that it's itchy business being a porcupine. First thing they do when they wake up and after they've warmed up on the stoop is spend some time scratching. And porcupines are such curious animals. Once they got used to me just sort of hanging out there, especially hanging out there with Burdock, who obviously knew me, they would just come over and start exploring and sniffing. And Dan in particular just seemed to want to hang around me for some reason. And I don't, as a rule, encourage people to allow wild animals to become habituated into human presence. But in this case, we're out here far away from people in the Porcupines neighborhood and no other people around. And we will see what happens. And Dan, so here's Dan just taking a snooze on a rock next to me. Another porcupine that lived in the throne room of this den complex, I called Her Royal Highness, HRH for short. And she would climb down a little after Dan got up. And here is HRH approaching Dan, who is dining on some acorns. So they get right up in each other's faces. And the one who's eating always squeals and rebuffs the one who approaches. But the one who approaches is learning something from this encounter. What are you eating? Where are you finding it? I'm pretty sure that HRH is also a female porcupine. And she also comes over to say hello and explores all of the weird things I'm bringing. So I just have this idea that porcupines are saying, all right, I see that you're not dangerous. Are you an ally? What do you have to offer? Here's little Fuzzy, who still lives today up at High Scenic. She's got a very distinctive appearance. And unlike a lot of the other animals that I know and deal with, porcupines all look different. So you really can get to know them as individuals. She crawls out of her hole and rests for the longest time. And then Quirinus, he is a big dominant male in the area, and he's not living in this den complex, but he passes through. So he just shows up eventually, and he goes up and says hello to everyone who's there. And this is I go up to visit Burdock with a book and a hotspot and a bunch of other things. And Quirinus decides to sit down one evening right on top of all of this stuff and sends my hotspot deep, deep down into a grotto in the rocks. And I have the hardest time recovering it, but he's a magnificent fellow. I call him, because of this helmet of quills he has, I thought he looked like a Roman god. And Quirinus is the Roman god for the wielder of spears. And here he is doing this thing male porcupines do when they go visiting. I'm a little embarrassed to tell you about it. It doesn't flatter porcupines, but the males go up all year round. When they find a female, they rear up in front of them. And what he's doing that you can't see is he's sticking his willy out. That's a scientific term. And she is saying, oh, that is disgusting. Go away, you brute. And their mating season is, as I said, I have no idea why they do this around you. and he has been spurned, poor guy. And the last porcupine that I was to meet here at this ledge site was Wee, this tiny little porcupine, must have been the same age as Burdock, crawled out of a little crack in the rocks one day. Just a tiny little porcupine. Here he is about to fall off a rock. Going over to say hello to Burdock. So that's Burdock and Wee for a size comparison. So now I'm going to take you to the last day of porcupine watching at High Scenic. So when spring comes, the porcupines all abandon their dens and head off into the woods for the summer, and you can no longer predictably find them. But on this last night, I was afraid I wasn't going to see anybody because I've been seeing fewer and fewer porcupines. So it's now April 19th. And I arrive. There's Dangerous Dan hanging around. Little Fuzzy gets up, has some acorns. Dan and Fuzzy, Wee comes out. And Wee has decided to try and learn how to eat acorns. So usually they really are able to grab on with their top teeth and work away at the bottom of the acorn. But Wee just doesn't quite have the hang of it. That other sound you're hearing is actually squirrels that I'm carrying in my jacket that need to be fed. So poor little Wee then proceeds to go along and visit all of the other porcupines to see if anyone else can help him. He goes to see Dangerous Dan and Little Fuzzy, and they all just squeal at him and chase him away. There's HRH, and Wee gets similar treatment from her. And finally, Quirinus shows up and makes the rounds. And he is no nicer to Wee. And then finally, it's getting dark. It's too dark to get any pictures. And I hear Burdock coming along through the woods, making his nice little humming noises. And right behind Burdock is Wee. And I'm so sure that Burdock is going to be just as mean to Wee as everybody else. And sure enough, once he figures out that Wee is behind him, he whirls around and rears up, and then he lunges onto Wee, and the two of them are playing just like Burdock played with his puppet. Here's just a little Burdock play sequence to give you the idea. Not particularly rowdy play, but porcupine play. So what I've learned from hanging out this spring with Burdock and his friends is that we've got 6 porcupines in an area more or less amicably, seeking out and choosing to be together. They have a complex system of vocal and aromatic communications. And then these guys, so Burdock and Wee played and played and played up and down the bank, up and down trees, and finally it ended as roughhousing often does. One of them got really annoyed and squealed at the other, and that was the end of that. And now it's time for another season of porcupine watching. This is a little bit briefer, but I knew that I wouldn't see Burdock again until the next winter, when they returned to their den sites, I would have no way to find him. And porcupines changed so much from that first year to the second year. I didn't think I'd be able to recognize him. So as soon as they denned up, I started visiting all of the porcupine dens, hoping that I would be able to find my pal Burdock. And winter went by and I didn't find him anywhere. I saw lots of porcupines that I thought might be Burdock, but I wasn't quite sure. So when spring returned, I returned to High Scenic, and here's little Fuzzy back out on the rocks. And then this crazy porcupine shows up, and this turns out to be Wee, all grown up and looking like a haystack. And what does he do? Turns out he's a he. He gets right in Quirinus's face and challenges his dominance. There's Quirinus, and there's sassy little Wee. And what happened was, I wish I'd gotten this on film. We kept challenging Quirinus. Quirinus just magnanimously ignored him until once we came over and Quirinus just gave him a slam on his backside with his paws. And this is Quirinus pulling the quills out of his paws after that encounter. Very nonchalant. Oh yes, quills, quills. And we is resulting in a corner, and he learned his lesson, I guess. So that year I was taking care of a porcupine who'd been hit by a car and had her in an outdoor enclosure. And interestingly, that year, all of the other porcupines showed up at my house to visit this porcupine. So this is where part of the social scene happened. Here's Dangerous Dan on Easter visiting the Easter porcupine and checking out the porcupine in my enclosure. And I had a bear coming around at the time who was very interested in my goat. So I set up a tent in the backyard and was sleeping out. And Dangerous Dan would walk by periodically and do a little greeting. She'd say, and I'd say, hi, Dan. And one night, a porcupine, a Dangerous Dan, walked, all right, it wasn't Dangerous Dan, walked right into my tent and bit me on the head. And of course, that was Burdock. So it was a love bite. It was a very joyful reunion. And Burdock hung around. It's now season when porcupines are dispersing. Look at Burdock. What a handsome, handsome yearling porcupine. We had a few nice visits, and then he dispersed again into the wilderness. He and the goat really learned to leave each other alone. I should say the goat learned to leave him alone after a forehead full of quills. And so then I started to look for Burdock again the next year. Oh, all right, we'll do this first, and then I'll get to Burdock the next year. So porcupines, what we've learned about porcupines from following Burdock: solitary, unflappable, curmudgeonly, but they exist in a society. They have a complex system of vocal and aromatic communication, share den sites and foods in surplus. They have friends and they play. I got a quote here for you. I just have to find it. So, like bears, porcupines are considered to be solitary, And Ben Killam and E.O. Wilson both argue that through the study of sociobiology, understanding the evolutionary roots of our social behavior, we'll be able to recognize and transcend behaviors that no longer serve us, like, say, those bears' explosive bursts of emotion that reinforce rules. And I wonder if we wouldn't do better to recognize and reclaim behaviors that, if Ben is right, should be part of our social repertoire. Like, let us look to the porcupines and remember that in our roots may be an inclination to welcome strangers, even strangers as obnoxious as this one. And even the most unusual strangers could be potential allies. And we will leave it right there, and I will answer your questions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Patty. That was a fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed the videos and the sounds that porcupines make. They were just so adorable. We have a lot of questions coming in, and quite a few people were asking about their average weight and their age and their ranges, if you could address those questions.
Okay. Porcupines look big, but the biggest ones weigh under 20 pounds, more like 18, 19 pounds. And that's when they're nice and fat and going into the winter. So yeah, between 10 and 20 pounds for an adult porcupine. I'm actually surprised at how far they travel. You think of them as being short-legged and not particularly ambulatory, but they cover a lot of ground. I can't give you the territory size of a porcupine, but they do use different parts of their territory in different seasons. And I'll have to refer you to Aldous Rose and the North American porcupine for more on that. What was the other? Oh, how long do they live?
Yeah.
They're known to live to be 20 years old. And that's a very old porcupine, but.
And is there a good way to age porcupine? Someone asked about the color of their quills. It seemed like they got more white as they aged. Is that
they
accurate?
will get gray on their muzzles as they get old, but the white quills, there's a lot of variation in porcupine coat color, and some porcupines will just look very pale throughout their whole lives. So it's more the facial fur color.
Got it. We had a couple of questions about what to do when you see a porcupine in your yard. Someone, it was Lynn, who said she saw her cat trying to play with a porcupine in the yard and they were crying at each other. Is that normal behavior? What would you recommend in this situation?
I've never heard of a cat trying to play with porcupine before. That is a weird cat. I'll say that's a weird cat. If the porcupine is not afraid and it's just playing back, then there's probably nothing to worry about. If the cat is actually stalking the porcupine and jumps on it, then there might be a problem. But probably not the kind of problem you're going to get when you have a dog that bites a porcupine.
Yeah, I've got a dog and almost everybody I know who's got a dog has had encounters.
I hear that some dogs learn and other dogs are just vindictive. So
yeah. There were some questions about albino porcupines.
yeah,
I've seen. What is that?
Fairly common in porcupines. So I can't imagine that it would be advantageous in any way. I'm not sure why it is. It's probably similar to how there are so many melanistic gray squirrels. It's in different populations. It's just a gene that persists somehow.
And so because of this format, the Zoom format, some of the videos were a little bit choppy. Is there a way we can watch those in another place? I know you have a blog. Are any of those posted there?
Yes. Some of the burdock ones aren't. I'll try and put together a little selection of the videos that were shown this evening, so I'll send them to you, Miles.
So someone was asking about the quills shooting out. Can you talk more about how the defense works with the porcupine?
Sometimes it might seem like they're shooting out just because as a porcupine waves its tail, there might be loose quills that fall out, but they're not capable of shooting their quills. That is a very popular rural myth. The quills are held in place by some connective tissue. And when they raise their quills and that connective tissue becomes taut, if you push down on the quill at that moment, it can break that connective tissue and the quills come out. Otherwise, they're pretty well part of the porcupine, just like our hair. Yeah. So it's only when they're worried that the quills can come out.
Yeah, that's so neat. People are asking about their natural predators. Can you talk a little bit? I think you mentioned them as a friend in your presentation, but
yeah, so the major predator of porcupines is the fisher. And I have to say that in my woods where I have many porcupines and many fisher, I have only seen evidence of a porcupine being eaten by a fisher once. I think they are much happier eating things that are less prickly, like red squirrels and snowshoe hare. So I used to worry every time I saw fisher tracks going up to my porcupine dens, but I have stopped doing that. And I'll tell you what the main concern for porcupines is, and that is, ironically, it's raccoons. And not because raccoons kill porcupines, they don't, but they carry a parasite, and porcupines will manage to ingest the one life stage of this parasite, and it will kill porcupines and a number of other rodents as well, but mostly I've seen it in porcupines. It's the raccoon roundworm, and it gets into their eyes and their brains, and there's just nothing you can do. So I've, as a wildlife rehabilitator, seen a lot more porcupine death from microscopic predators. They're not really predators, of course, parasites, than even from real predators. I've heard bobcats will occasionally be hungry enough to try and attack a porcupine, and even coyotes. I think they're not successful very often.
Yeah, they're pretty well protected from most things, I guess.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Sai was asking about the proper way to pick up a porcupine if you're ever so lucky that they don't that they trust you,
Oh yeah, Sai. It's if they're cooperative, you just reach your hand under the belly between their hind legs and get it under the tail, and then you lift them up and put your other hand between their front legs, and that's how you hold them.
Well, fairly simple. There was one more question. Do porcupines girdle trees, or is that only beavers? What kind of tree damage do they do?
Porcupines will girdle trees mostly up high where they're feeding. They're eating that cambium in the winter, but you won't see them girdling trees at the base like beavers very often, except in the winter if they're denning in a beech tree. I've seen them just come out and say, "Oh, midnight snack, I don't want to climb," and they'll just eat the bark at the base of that beech tree. I've seen that occasionally.
All right, well, being mindful on time, I think that's about it. And we want to say thank you, Patti, for that great presentation. There's a lot of people, you might want to check out the chat, actually. A lot of people saying thank you so much, that they learned a lot tonight. That was a great program. So thanks again, and good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone.